Predators don't wait for mistakes. They create them. From rooftop campers mauled in Russia to bikers ambushed in Maine, these are raw, real moments when humans meet nature's fury. In this video, we'll dive into 6 terrifying true stories from poachers, snowboarders, loggers, and fishermen, each caught in life-or-death encounters that prove one truth. In the wild, survival isn't guaranteed, only fought for. On October 4th, 2025, the dark forest of Russia's Ussuri Krai was quiet, except for the soft hum of insects and the distant rush of a river. 5 friends from Vladivostok had arrived earlier that day for a short weekend camping trip. They had parked their SUVs in a clearing by the water, setting up rooftop tents and small campfires as dusk settled over the valley. The group had spent the evening laughing, cooking fresh fish, and telling stories under the pale light of the moon. The smell of grilled food lingered in the cold air, drifting into the nearby woods. None of them noticed the shadow moving through the trees, its massive body silent against the ground. By midnight, the fire had burned down to a low level. The campers climbed into their tents on top of the vehicles, locking up their coolers and gear below. The river murmured, the night wind whistling faintly through the branches. But at 12:40 a.m., the stillness shattered. A heavy crack echoed from the forest edge as a huge Russian grizzly stepped out into the open. Its thick coat glistened in the moonlight, and its eyes reflected a dull, menacing gleam. The bear had caught the scent of food, mixed with the faint trace of cooking smoke. It moved closer, each step deliberate and heavy. Within seconds, it reached the first vehicle. The metal creaked under its weight as it climbed onto the hood, its claws leaving deep scratches on the surface. The campers stirred, hearing the noise, but it was too late to react. With a violent roar, the bear lunged at the first rooftop tent, tearing through the fabric like paper. 2 of the men inside screamed as the structure collapsed around them. One was struck instantly, the other thrown down from the roof as the bear swiped again, its claws cutting through canvas and flesh alike. The sound of tearing fabric, smashing glass, and panicked cries filled the clearing. Another camper tried to grab a hatchet from below, but barely managed to open the car door before the beast turned on him. The bear pinned him beneath its massive frame, its jaws snapping and blood soaking the ground. The vehicles rocked violently as the predator moved from one to another, crushing poles and bending metal beneath its power. One tent fell completely, trapping 2 campers inside. Their desperate shouts were drowned by the bear's growls and the sound of claws raking across the metal roofs. The attack lasted less than 5 minutes, but it felt endless in the cold, echoing night. The last tent collapsed as the grizzly's rampage came to a sudden halt. Breathing heavily, the animal turned toward the riverbank, leaving behind a silent, ruined camp. As dawn broke, mist covered the clearing like a veil. Sergei Ivanov, a fisherman nearby, spotted the wreckage from the river and approached carefully. The scene before him was almost unreal. Dented vehicles, shredded tents, torn sleeping bags, and claw marks deep in the metal. The bear was gone, but the destruction it left behind told a story of pure terror that had unfolded beneath the moonlight. Sergei Ivanov stood frozen near the destroyed camp as the morning light grew brighter across the valley. The cold air carried the smell of blood, smoke, and crushed earth. The 5 vehicles stood silent and twisted, their roofs bent and their tents torn open like paper. Sergei moved slowly between the wrecks, his boots sinking into the damp ground, each step heavier than the last. The damage around him spoke of unimaginable power and speed. One SUV had deep claw marks across the hood. Another was missing a side mirror, torn clean off, and a third had its windows smashed inward. The ground was littered with broken poles, scattered clothing, and shattered lanterns. The campfire had burned out completely, leaving only faint wisps of smoke curling into the morning air. He found signs of the terrible struggle everywhere. Bloodstains streaked the frozen mud, leading toward the riverbank where the bear had vanished into the forest. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the distant cry of ravens circling above the tree line. Sergei backed away, his heart pounding, and rushed down the trail toward the nearest ranger outpost. It took more than 2 hours, navigating rough ground, to reach help. By the time rescue teams arrived, the clearing had become a grim scene of investigation. Wildlife officers, medical responders, and police moved carefully among the remains. The bodies of the 5 campers were recovered, each one lying near their vehicles, their equipment still scattered. One officer pointed out the size of the claw marks on the steel frame of a truck door, each slash more than 5 inches apart. The sheer force that had dented the metal stunned even the most experienced rangers. Helicopters circled above, and a small group of villagers gathered at the forest edge, watching in silence. Reporters would later describe the attack as one of the most violent bear incidents in the region's history. The rescuers followed the bear's tracks deep into the forest, finding broken branches and patches of fur along the trail. Eventually, the animal was tracked down by wildlife authorities several kilometers away. It was confirmed to be an old male grizzly, likely starving and weakened, driven inland by the lack of food along the river. Its condition explained its unusual aggression, yet the devastation it caused still shocked everyone. As night fell again over the valley, search teams finished their work and sealed the area. The SUVs were left in place as evidence, their twisted roofs standing as silent reminders of what had happened. Locals spoke in hushed tones about the power of the wilderness and how even seasoned campers could not predict when nature might strike. A memorial was later built near the site, marked by 5 wooden crosses overlooking the river where the group had camped. In the weeks that followed, new safety rules were introduced for travelers and hunters in the Ussuri Krai, requiring bear-proof storage for food and stronger warnings for campers. But for those who visited the place afterward, the story remained unforgettable. The marks on the metal, the torn earth, and the eerie quiet that settled over the clearing served as a lasting memory of that tragic October night when 5 lives were lost beneath the shadow of a single enraged predator. On July 18, 2023, the heat of a midsummer afternoon hung heavy over a quiet gas station tucked deep in northern Maine. The road stretched endlessly through thick forest, and for miles there was no sign of another building or voice. A small group of bikers, tired and dusty from hours of riding, pulled up to refuel. The air smelled of gasoline and pine, and the hum of engines faded into the stillness of the woods. Laughter and the clinking of helmets broke the silence as they stretched their legs, unaware that something massive was already watching them from the shadows beyond the pumps. The scent of snacks, spilled soda, and open fuel containers drifted through the warm air. From the tree line, a large black bear stirred. Hungry and bold, it lumbered closer, its nose twitching as it caught the mix of food and human scent. The riders were distracted, taking off gloves and pulling out sandwiches from their saddlebags. None noticed the dark shape slipping between the trees until it was already at the edge of the parking lot. Mark Reynolds, standing beside his motorcycle, spotted the bear first. Before he could react, the animal surged forward with terrifying speed, closing the distance in seconds. It swiped a heavy paw across Mark's side, knocking him against his bike. The motorcycle toppled with a crash, metal scraping against concrete, and the roar of panic filled the air. Helmets rolled across the lot as the bear turned, eyes fixed on movement and noise. Another rider tried to grab a metal canister, banging it against the pump post, but the sound only seemed to agitate the animal. It lunged again, claws flashing, tearing through a leather jacket and slicing deep into the forearm of another biker. The man fell backward, clutching his arm as blood spattered across the ground. The bear's attention shifted toward the smell of food inside an open saddlebag. It clawed and bit at the pack, tearing through granola bars and wrappers, growling with each motion. The bikers scattered, shouting and waving their arms, trying anything to scare it off. Their motorcycles, once symbols of control and power, now lay like fragile toys under the force of the predator's rage. For several tense minutes, chaos ruled the station. The bear moved between bikes, pushing one over with a grunt and raking its claws through another's seat. Mark, dazed and bleeding, crawled behind a fuel pump, gripping his side and watching in disbelief. The others stayed low, too terrified to move closer. Every sound, every clatter of metal, drew another aggressive turn from the animal. Just when it seemed the assault might not end, the distant rumble of an approaching truck broke through the noise. The headlights flashed through the lot, and the bear froze. Its ears flicked toward the sound, and with a low snarl it turned and lumbered back toward the tree line. Within seconds, it vanished into the shadows, leaving only overturned bikes, torn gear, and the ragged breathing of shaken survivors. When the truck pulled into view, Its driver found the scene in ruins. Scattered helmets, fuel dripping onto the pavement, and the smell of fear still thick in the air. The bikers stood in stunned silence, bruised, bloodied, and trembling from what had just happened. The calm of the wilderness had turned deadly in a matter of moments, and the road that once felt free now seemed filled with unseen danger. The stillness that followed the bear's retreat felt unreal. The sound of its heavy steps faded into the forest, until only the faint hum of engines and the soft rustle of trees remained. The bikers stood frozen among the wreckage, their hearts pounding, breaths uneven. The faint scent of blood and gasoline mingled in the cool air, a sharp reminder of how close they had come to disaster. Mark leaned heavily against the side of his fallen motorcycle, his arm throbbing and his side covered in dirt and scratches. Nearby, another rider sat on the ground with a torn sleeve, his forearm wrapped in a strip of cloth to slow the bleeding. The gas station, once a place of rest, now resembled a chaotic scene. Helmets lay cracked, seats torn apart, and supplies scattered across the concrete. Empty snack wrappers fluttered in the wind, a silent trace of what had drawn the predator in the first place. The smell of spilled fuel hung in the air, thick and dangerous. None of them spoke. Every rustle from the nearby brush made them flinch, as though the creature might return at any moment. After several minutes, the truck driver, who had unknowingly scared the bear off, stepped closer, eyes wide at the destruction. He helped the bikers move their damaged motorcycles away from the pumps and gather their gear. The injured were guided to the shade of the gas station awning, while the rest scanned the forest edge, alert for any movement. Slowly, the panic gave way to disbelief. When emergency services finally arrived, the scene was quiet again, though fear still lingered. Paramedics tended to the wounds, cleaning cuts and wrapping bandages around torn flesh. Mark's shoulder and ribs were bruised but not broken. Another biker's arm had been deeply cut, requiring stitches. The others were shaken, but alive. The officers who came after took photos of the broken bikes and claw marks on the concrete, noting how easily the animal had overpowered a group of strong, capable riders. As the sun began to set, long shadows stretched over the lot, and the bikers sat in silence, watching their ruined machines being loaded into a tow truck. The reality of what had happened began to sink in. A peaceful stop on an empty road had almost cost them their lives. One mistake, leaving food out, ignoring the forest's quiet, had invited danger that none of them could control. By evening, news of the attack had spread through nearby towns, warning travelers to secure their supplies and remain vigilant. Wildlife officers arrived later to search for the bear, explaining that black bears in the area had become increasingly bold due to food left behind by campers and travelers. They placed traps and posted warnings along the roadside, but most locals knew that once a bear learned to associate humans with food, it often returned. Days later, the riders reunited to collect their repaired bikes from a nearby shop. Their laughter was softer now, their voices quieter. None could shake the memory of claws tearing through metal and the helpless feeling that came with being trapped between fear and the need for survival. Mark's arm still carried faint scars, and every time he rode past a forested stretch, his grip on the handlebars tightened just a little. The memory of that day would remain etched in their minds forever, not as a story of adventure, but as a lesson in how quickly calm can turn into chaos. The wilderness, even from the edge of a gas station, had shown its power. For the bikers, it was a lasting reminder that nature never forgets its strength, and that even brief moments of carelessness can bring one face to face with something wild and unstoppable. On March 14, 2020, the frozen peaks of Kodiak Island gleamed under a pale winter sun as snowboarder Jenna Callahan began her descent down a steep backcountry slope. The snow was deep and powdery, the air crisp, and the silence of the mountain was broken only by the hiss of her board carving through the drifts. She had been riding for hours, far from any resort or marked trail, chasing the untouched snow that only the wild Alaskan backcountry could offer. Her backpack carried safety gear, a flare gun, and a small pack of food, but she felt completely alone in the vast white world around her. As she cut across a narrow ridge, Jenna noticed something that made her slow down. Deep, wide impressions pressed into the snow near a cluster of bare spruce trees. They were not human. The shape and depth were unmistakable. Bear tracks, large and fresh. She paused, breath fogging in the cold air, the wind whispering through the branches below. The trail of prints led down toward a half-frozen river, where meltwater had begun to flow beneath the ice. Somewhere nearby, a giant was moving through the same silence she had once found peaceful. Without warning, the calm broke. From the edge of the tree line, a massive Kodiak bear burst into view, fur dusted with snow, eyes fixed on movement. It had been feeding near the melting river, and Jenna's presence had startled it. The distance between them vanished in seconds as the predator charged up the slope. Snow exploded beneath its paws, spraying in every direction. Jenna tried to pivot her board, but the hill was too uneven. The bear's first swipe caught the edge of her snowboard, spinning her violently. She crashed hard, sliding into powder and slamming her shoulder against a buried rock. The impact knocked the air from her lungs. As she tried to push herself up, the bear loomed above her, steam rising from its body. Its jaws snapped, teeth clacking so close she could feel the rush of air against her legs. Its massive paw came down again, raking across her backpack and shredding the fabric. She kicked and twisted, sending up a spray of snow, trying to keep distance between them. In pure instinct, Jenna reached for the small flare gun clipped to her pack. Her fingers trembled and slipped against the cold metal. The bear pawed again, tearing deeper into the snow beside her boots, its growl echoing through the valley. Somehow, she managed to pull the trigger. The flare burst into bright orange light, hissing and crackling through the frigid air. The sudden blaze startled the bear. It froze, blinking against the brightness, then huffed and turned, padding heavily toward the tree line. The snow settled in its wake, leaving deep tracks that vanished into the dark brush. Jenna lay still, her chest heaving, the flare light fading into the falling dusk. Bruised, shaken, and bleeding from her shoulder and back, she crawled up the ridge, dragging her board behind her. Every step burned, but the will to survive was stronger than the pain. The quiet of the mountain returned, but it no longer felt peaceful. It felt like a warning carved into ice. Jenna clung to the ridge, her hands trembling from the cold and pain. The wind had picked up, howling across the slope and sweeping fresh snow into the air. The sky above had turned gray, and visibility dropped with each passing minute. Her breathing came in short, sharp bursts, every inhale burning against the freezing air. The flare's faint smoke trail disappeared into the wind, leaving her alone again in the silent white world. The bear was gone, but fear still pressed heavily on her chest, a constant reminder of how close she had come to losing her life. She forced herself to move slowly along the ridge, careful not to slip on the slick ice beneath the snow. Her legs ached, and blood from the cuts on her back soaked through her jacket, freezing almost instantly. Her snowboard dragged behind her, its edge leaving a crooked line in the powder. She knew she needed to reach her snowmobile, parked miles away near the valley floor, but the slope was long and treacherous. Her muscles screamed with each motion, and the cold bit deeper into her body. As she descended, the sound of distant cracking ice reached her ears. Somewhere below, the river continued to break open as the season shifted. The same melting current that had drawn the bear still cut through the valley, a jagged black scar in the endless white. Jenna stayed close to the ridgeline, keeping her eyes fixed on the path ahead of her. Every shadow made her heart race. She half expected the bear to return at any moment, emerging from the fog again with the same unstoppable fury. Minutes turned into an hour. Her vision blurred, and her body moved instinctively. She finally spotted the faint outline of her snowmobile through the haze, half buried in drifted snow. Relief filled her, but so did exhaustion. She stumbled the last few feet, falling to her knees beside it. Her gloves were stiff with frost, and it took several tries before she could pull the starter cord. The engine sputtered, then came to life with a rough growl that echoed off the cliffs. Jenna climbed onto the seat, wincing as pain shot through her injured side. The vibrations from the snowmobile made her whole body ache, but the sound was comforting. It meant she had a chance to survive. She turned toward the distant outline of the small lodge where she had begun her morning. The ride back was slow and rough. Snow whipped against her face, and the wind howled around her like a living thing. Each mile felt longer than the last. When she finally reached the base camp, the sun had vanished, leaving only the dim glow of lanterns in the windows. She collapsed near the door, too weak to speak, her gear torn and her skin pale. The others rushed to pull her inside, wrapping her in blankets and tending to her wounds. Hours later, as she lay recovering, the weight of what had happened began to sink in. The memory of the bear's roar, the flash of its teeth, and the crushing force of its paws replayed endlessly in her mind. The wilderness she had always loved now felt unpredictable and wild beyond reason. Experts later stated that the bear had likely wandered inland, desperate for food as the snowmelt arrived early that year. Jenna survived with scars across her back and shoulders, a fractured rib, and frostbite on her fingers. But the deepest wound was not visible. It was the haunting understanding that in Alaska's raw and frozen beauty, even a moment of calm could hide the presence of something ancient, powerful, and untamed waiting just beyond the next drift of snow. On September 19, 2025, the cold air around a remote Alaskan river carried the sharp smell of pine and wet soil. The water moved slowly, glinting beneath gray clouds that hung heavy over the valley. Hidden between the trees, a group of poachers worked quickly, setting metal traps and stacking fresh pelts into the back of a mud-splattered truck. Their boots sank into the damp earth as they moved, unaware that something far larger was watching from the edge of the spruce thickets. Deep within the brush, a massive grizzly bear moved silently, its thick fur streaked with dried blood from an old wound. The animal had once been caught in one of their snares weeks before, escaping only after tearing free with raw strength. The memory of that pain lingered, and now, guided by scent and sound, it followed their trail once more. The forest held its breath as the bear drew closer, its wide paws crushing moss and twigs with each slow step. The men laughed and talked near the truck, the clinking of traps and metal echoing faintly through the trees. They had no idea that danger was less than 50 yards away, crouched behind the tall grass, waiting. Then, without warning, the silence broke. The bear burst from the thicket with a guttural roar that shook the air. Its enormous frame crashed through the undergrowth, claws slicing through saplings as it charged straight toward the clearing. The nearest man froze, his eyes wide as the beast slammed into the side of the truck. Metal crumpled with a sickening crack. The tires hissed and deflated as the bear's claws tore deep grooves into the rubber. One poacher tried to run but stumbled over a fallen log, hitting the ground hard. The bear turned toward him, its jaws snapping inches from his boots as he kicked frantically, scraping his legs on the dirt and rocks. Another man raised his rifle and fired into the air, but the sound only seemed to enrage the animal further. It swung one massive paw and sent a cooler flying across the clearing, its contents spilling into the mud. Traps and chains scattered as the creature charged again, colliding with the side of the vehicle so hard that the rear door ripped open. The man who had fallen managed to crawl behind a pile of broken logs, his breath shallow, every muscle frozen with fear. The grizzly circled the clearing, grunting and pacing, its fur bristling and eyes glowing with fury. A second poacher dove into the shallow river, splashing water everywhere as he tried to escape. The bear followed him halfway, sending waves crashing against the rocks, before turning its attention back to the camp. It tore through a pile of gear, shredding backpacks and pelts, flattening anything that stood in its path. For nearly 10 minutes, the clearing was a scene of pure chaos. Every sound, the roar, the crashing wood, the snapping of metal, echoed through the trees. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. The grizzly stood still for a moment, its body trembling with rage, its breath coming in heavy, gasping breaths. With a final growl, it turned and disappeared back into the forest, leaving silence and ruin behind. The poachers lay scattered across the clearing, bruised, bleeding, and stunned by what had just happened. The forest around them felt different now, heavier, darker, and filled with a presence they could not forget. The silence that followed the rampage was heavy and strange. The forest, moments ago filled with roars and the sound of breaking wood, now felt hollow. Smoke from the damaged truck rose slowly into the gray air as the men pulled themselves up, their hands shaking. Mud clung to their torn clothes, and blood dripped from deep cuts along their arms and legs. The truck's doors hung open, the metal twisted, tires shredded, and traps scattered across the ground like broken bones. Mikhail, the youngest among them, limped toward the wreckage, staring at the claw marks carved deep into the steel. Every groove was a reminder of what had just happened. The others searched the clearing in silence, afraid the bear might return. The smell of fuel mixed with blood and wet earth, and the river nearby seemed louder now, as if swallowing their fear. One man knelt beside the broken snares and chains, realizing how useless their tools had been against such power. As the first rays of dawn pushed through the clouds, the men gathered what they could. Most of their pelts were ruined, soaked in mud and water. The truck barely started, its engine coughing and sputtering from the damage. No one spoke. They drove slowly down the narrow trail, eyes fixed on the tree line, half expecting the massive shape to reappear. Hours later, when they reached a ranger outpost, word spread quickly. Rangers arrived at the site to find the ground torn apart, traps smashed, and signs of a fierce struggle. The story of the attack traveled fast through nearby towns. Locals said it was as if the wilderness itself had struck back, punishing the greed that had disturbed its quiet. Weeks later, the men still carried the memory of that night. Their bruises faded, but the fear did not. The sound of snapping branches or the sight of fresh tracks in mud sent chills down their spines. For them, the forest would never again be silent or safe. It had a heartbeat, a presence, and a power they would never forget. On October 22, 2017, the sound of chainsaws echoed through the Carpathian Mountains as a group of Romanian loggers worked deep inside a misty clearing surrounded by tall beech trees. The men had been cutting and stacking timber since early morning, their camp littered with sawdust, oil cans, and half-eaten meals from lunch. The air smelled of wood, fuel, and roasted meat, mixing into a scent that drifted far into the forest. Unnoticed by the workers, a massive brown bear had been moving closer, drawn by the strong smells and the low rumble of machinery that vibrated through the ground. The crew continued their work, laughing and shouting over the whir of chainsaws. Nearby, one worker leaned against a fallen log, wiping sweat from his brow. Just beyond the tree line, the forest fell silent. Birds stopped calling, and the faint crack of snapping twigs broke through the steady rhythm of their tools. Before anyone could react, the huge bear burst out from the thick brush, roaring with raw fury. Its paws tore into the ground, scattering leaves and mud as it charged straight toward the nearest man. The worker turned too late. The bear's swipe hit the chainsaw from his hands, sending it spinning into the dirt with a sharp clang. The force of the blow knocked him backward, scraping his arm and tearing through his sleeve. The crew shouted in panic, their voices rising over the mechanical noise still echoing in the background. Logs rolled under their boots as they scrambled to get away. The predator reared up, its shadow stretching across the clearing, and then dropped down again, smashing into a pile of freshly cut timber. Another man, caught too close, tried to run, but tripped over a rope. The bear swung at him, striking across his back with its claws, leaving deep marks that tore through his jacket. He fell face first into the mud, groaning in pain. Others grabbed metal rods and started banging them together, hoping to scare the beast off, but it only roared louder. Its eyes flicked from the scattered food bags to the smell of fuel nearby, its rage feeding on confusion and hunger. For what felt like an eternity, the clearing descended into a storm of chaos. The animal clawed through tents, shredding tarps and tossing tools aside like toys. A container of oil spilled, staining the ground black. The men huddled behind stacks of timber, hearts pounding, afraid to move. Every sound, the crash of falling wood, the growl of the bear, seemed to stretch time longer. Finally, after 8 long minutes of destruction, the animal began to slow. It sniffed at a torn lunch bag, then turned toward the dense forest again. With one final growl that echoed across the valley, it disappeared into the shadows, leaving silence behind. The clearing looked like a war zone. Flattened tents, crushed helmets, claw marks on the trees, signs of the wild fury that had swept through so suddenly. The workers stood frozen, staring at the damage around them. Blood and mud mixed on the ground, the smell of oil still heavy in the air. None of them spoke. They had survived, but they all knew the mountain had changed that day, reminding them how fragile human strength truly is against the power of nature. The men slowly gathered their strength, their bodies aching and covered in dirt. The quiet after the chaos felt almost unreal. Broken equipment lay scattered around them, and the smell of oil mixed with blood and damp soil. The forest that had roared with noise minutes before was now still, as if holding its breath. A few of the men helped their injured co-workers toward a fallen tree, using torn pieces of cloth to stop the bleeding. Every movement felt heavy. their nerves still trembling from what had just happened. The forest edge looked darker now, the shadows deeper, and every rustle of leaves made them flinch. They knew the animal could return at any time, and the fear of another charge kept their eyes fixed on the tree line. Birds slowly began to call again, their sounds sharp and distant. One man found his chainsaw crushed under a log. Another picked up the bent rods that had been used in desperation to scare the bear away. Their small camp, once full of noise and rhythm, now looked wrecked and empty. Hours later, a team from a nearby site arrived after hearing the commotion. They found the clearing covered in claw marks, footprints, and deep grooves in the soil. Medical kits were opened, and the injured were bandaged and carried to the trucks waiting down the road. The ride back was silent, the air heavy with a sense of shock. No one looked out the windows. The thick trees passing by seemed endless, like the same forest that had just turned against them. When they finally reached the main camp, officials took reports and warned that the attack had been caused by hunger and human activity in bear territory. The workers sat near the fire, staring into the flames as the cold mountain air settled around them. The marks on the trees and the torn tents would remain as reminders of that morning when strength and steel could not stop the wild. In that clearing, they had seen how close danger lived to their work, waiting just beyond the silence of the forest. On March 7, 2024, the frozen fjords of Svalbard stretched endlessly under a pale Arctic sun as Lucas and Eric prepared for a long day of ice fishing. The air was sharp and silent, broken only by the sound of augers cutting through the thick sheet of ice. Their small wooden hut sat alone in the vast white wilderness, surrounded by snowdrifts and frozen sea. Both men wore heavy insulated suits and fur-lined gloves, their breath turning to mist with every exhale. The cold was unforgiving, but the promise of good fish kept their spirits high. Buckets lined the edge of the hole they had drilled, filled with fresh catches from the icy depths. Hours passed quietly, until Lucas noticed something strange on the horizon. A faint movement against the white glow of snow and sky. At first, he thought it was a drifting shadow, maybe a distant block of ice shifting in the wind. But soon, a shape began to take form, moving steadily closer. It was massive, powerful, and ghost-like against the frozen plain. The air felt heavier as the figure grew larger with every step. Before they could react, the huge polar bear charged. The impact was like a thunderclap. The animal smashed into the side of the fishing hut, sending wood splinters and gear flying across the ice. The small stove tipped over, flames sputtering out as the roof sagged. Lucas tried to push himself away, but the bear's claws came down fast, tearing through his thick jacket and slicing deep into his shoulder. He hit the ice hard, the cold biting through him even as pain burned across his body. Eric froze for a moment, then scrambled behind a crate, his hands trembling as the predator turned its head toward him. The bear's massive paw swung out, crashing into the crate and sending it sliding across the slick surface. Its claws nearly caught Eric's legs, the sound of its growl echoing across the ice like thunder. The two men were trapped in the open, their small shelter now a pile of broken boards. For several minutes, the polar bear circled them, pacing on heavy paws that left deep impressions in the snow. Its breath came out in white bursts, and its black eyes fixed sharply on every movement. Lucas, bleeding and gasping, tried to crawl backward while Eric fumbled for a flare gun in the wreckage. Buckets spilled, fish scattered, and gear clattered across the ice as the bear swiped at anything that moved. Finally, Eric managed to spark the flare. The sudden burst of light and heat startled the animal, which reared back with a furious roar. Its massive head swung side to side, confused by the strange glow. That brief moment of distraction gave them their only chance. Crawling through the wreckage, the men dragged themselves away from the shattered hut, hearts pounding and limbs stiff with fear. Behind them, the white giant stood tall in the glowing haze, watching as they disappeared into the endless Arctic mist. The two men crawled across the icy surface, their bodies shaking from pain and cold. The faint glow from the flare faded behind them, swallowed by the endless white. Every movement sent waves of pain through Lucas's wounded shoulder, while Eric dragged him forward, gasping for breath in the freezing air. Their gloves were torn, and their knees scraped against the sharp ice, but stopping was not an option. The sound of the bear's heavy steps had vanished, yet fear still gripped them. Each gust of wind sounded like another charge from the unseen predator. After what felt like hours, they reached the edge of the fjord where their snowmobile was half buried in snow. Eric struggled to start it, his hands numb and stiff. The engine finally sputtered to life, and they climbed on, moving slowly through the fog toward their distant camp. Lucas's blood had frozen against his torn suit, and the color was drained from his face. The biting wind cut through them like blades, and every bump of the snow sent pain through their battered bodies. When they finally reached camp, other fishermen rushed to help, wrapping Lucas in blankets and calling for rescue. The sky had begun to darken again, the dim Arctic light fading into long shadows. A rescue helicopter arrived hours later, its blades slicing through the snow-filled air. Lucas was lifted aboard, barely conscious, while Eric watched, trembling and exhausted. In the hospital at Longyearbyen, Lucas received stitches for deep cuts and treatment for frostbite. His shoulder was fractured, but he was alive. Eric had bruises and frost damage on his hands, but refused to rest until he knew his friend would recover. Officials visited them days later, warning about the growing number of polar bears approaching human activity. The attack became a stark reminder for everyone living in the far north that even the frozen silence of the Arctic holds dangers that can strike without warning. The two men never returned to the fjord again, their memories of that white field forever marked by the shadow of the Great Bear.